Hello folks and welcome back to my channel. I had the most exciting mail day this week. You have no idea. I finally have gotten my hands on a copy of A Guide to Successful Body Piercing. This is a guidebook on basically how to pierce from 1996. And it was produced by Spalding and Rogers, which was a company that was producing tools for piercings at the time. And I have been hunting down a good condition copy of this for so long, so you have no idea how excited I was about the eBay alert that I had finally stumbled across one. And I've actually owned a PDF of this for a while. It's just really cool to add something like this to my collection. But why I wanted to come on here and chat about it is because this is such an interesting peek into how different piercing was just 30 years ago. Which is crazy to think that this was published not even 30 years ago, 1996. And it is so incredible how far this industry has come in that time period. So let's take a peek to what successful body piercing looked like in 1996. We start off in the tools and supplies section, which is actually really solid. They talk about things like having ring openers and closers, receiving tubes, lots of tools that we still use every day as piercers. What jumps out to me when I look at this section is talking about having a germicide. They recommend Wavicide in this, used to soak jewelry before using it in piercings and clean your work surface. Jewelry should be soaked for 20 minutes or more and then rinsed with warm water before using. If you're thinking, just soaking and rinsing jewelry for my new body piercing, don't we sterilize jewelry that goes in new body piercings? You'd be correct. But back then, the usage of autoclaves, especially for sterilizing jewelry for new piercings, was not nearly as widespread as it is now. And so a lot of places were doing what we called a cold soak, where they literally just soaked jewelry in a cup of some kind of solution and then put that in your piercing. And it wasn't sterile. It wasn't sterile. It's a germicidal solution, but it is not sterile. And there were definitely problems that came with people doing this. Fun fact, the very first studio I worked at and did my first apprenticeship at did sometimes cold soak jewelry. We had an autoclave and we autoclaved most stuff, but if we didn't have like a color or a style already autoclaved and someone wanted it for a new piercing, my mentor taught me, you just take some maticide and soak the jewelry in it, and then you can pierce them with it, and it's fine. This is still a practice, not common, but still a practice you may encounter sometimes, even in the year of our Lord 2024. If someone tries to pierce you with cold-soaked jewelry, please run away. It is not safe, it is not sterile, but back in 1996, we were cold soaking, and that's what we were teaching for body piercing, and that's just crazy to me. Now this book walks through a whole setup for your piercing. I love that. It tells you like how to set up your tray and how to set up your workstation and like what supplies to make sure you have out. And I love how in-depth and detailed this is. You have to think in 1996, like people think it's hard to get an apprenticeship now. There just weren't apprenticeships back then. Like people went and took courses of the Fakir intensives and maybe got lucky enough to like work at Gauntlet through their apprenticeship program or a couple of the existing studios. But if you lived in many different states, if you lived in anywhere like not a huge city, there might not even be any piercers in your town. Like you wanting to become a body piercer and like going and taking a class or going and doing a seminar might be the most your town had for body piercing. So booklets like this and handouts like this and the Gauntlet Pierce with a Pro videos were essential. That was how people got the education and the training at that time. So I think it's so cool that this covers such an in-depth rundown of like setup and procedure. They do have a whole section on sterilization, which I really appreciate, but they only talk about sterilization of like contaminated tools. So like tools that you're using on different clients. There's no mention of sterilizing jewelry in this. So, like I mentioned, it's 1996, we're team cold soak. And then they get into piercing demonstrations. I would love to show these images here on YouTube, but they are all pretty explicit piercings. But they have like fully drawn and illustrated breakdowns of how to perform all sorts of different piercings with diagrams of the anatomy and how to like hold the tissue and pass the needle through. And I just think that is so cool and such a good like learning and educational resource for, again, people who did not have access to apprenticeships, or like something like this was really how they were learning how to pierce at the time. And if you're listening to me talking about this and you're thinking like, oh my God, Lynn, reading a book that's like a book, I use the term book loosely, like maybe 20 pages long and then like piercing people. Yes, that's how things were at the time. That's how people learned. That's why these days the industry is so strict about apprenticeships and like learning hands-on and learning the right way, because we already tried learning this way, and it had some disastrous results for a lot of people. So now, know better, do better, you know? The piercing aftercare section of this is where it really gets good. So I'm just gonna read you 1996 piercing aftercare instructions. You've just gotten a piercing. Here's what we're gonna do to take care of it. The first step in cleaning is to remove any matter which has dried on the jewelry or around the openings of the piercing. Solid. Good advice. Remove those crusties. Hey, I agree with it. Before washing, rinse this matter off with warm water only. Work the jewelry back and forth in the piercing to aid the process. The thought of moving my jewelry back and forth to try and get wet crusties off sounds awful. And just moving your jewelry a bunch in general is going to really damage that healing tissue on the inside and cause some problems. But again, it's 1996. We're time traveling. This is our aftercare. Next, work a small amount of soap into the piercing and leave it in contact with the skin for about 3 minutes. Lather up the piercing again and work the jewelry back and forth through the piercing a few times. So really make sure you're like scrubbing soap into your brand new body piercing. Now rinse the piercing thoroughly, again working the jewelry back and forth under running water to remove all traces of soap. Pat dry and then gently clean with peroxide and then alcohol. Apply a small amount of antibiotic ointment and be sure to work the jewelry back and forth with each application of solution and ointment. So after you've cleaned your piercing with soap for 3 minutes, really make sure you get peroxide and then alcohol all up in there. And then slather it with ointment and make sure you get that all up in there. Now they do say in big all caps to be sure to stop the use of alcohol and ointment on the 10th day. So this was done probably to prevent, concerns of infection during the first couple of days when a piercing was done. And it was probably a much bigger concern back then because we're not using sterile jewelry. We're just cold soaking our jewelry. We have some good content on sterilization practices in here, but it's not great. So I can see why infection would be a bigger concern back then. I'm sure they saw higher instances of infection because they weren't using as many work practice controls to try and minimize the risk of infection that we have access to today. We're autoclaving every single thing we use. We're wearing sterile gloves. We have top of the line surface disinfectants. Like these days, infection in body piercing is pretty rare. These days, not so much. But it's so interesting to me to look back at these aftercare instructions and how just overwhelmingly harsh they are for healing, and think about what it was like to get a piercing in a time period where your piercer was like, yeah, move the jewelry as much as you can, clean it with soap and then peroxide and then alcohol and then ointment. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I would have this many piercings if that was my aftercare, because that aftercare alone would have done me in. The final section of the book goes all over like different jewelry types and also different piercing types and placements, which I cannot show you here because again, they're a little not PG-13. But I do appreciate that they take the time to like cover all of the different jewelry styles and different materials that you work with. Like, they really thought about including everything in this. Now, after jewelry, like I mentioned, it gets to different types of piercings, and I love that hand web piercings are listed in this. Nestled between lip, tongue, navel, and nipple piercings, they specifically mention hand web piercings, which is how you know this was written in the 90s. They do at least mention that everyday manual labor and ease of infection makes hand web piercings difficult to heal and therefore something of a rarity. Usage restrictions and a rigorous cleaning routine are a must for a successful piercing between the thumb and index finger. And that's just crazy. Tragus piercings, no mention. Industrial piercings, I don't think industrials have been invented yet at the time of publishing this, actually, which is also really crazy when we think about there are some piercings that we're doing that are so popular they haven't even been mentioned. But philtrums, no mention. Vertical librettes, nothing. But 1996, you want to get your hand web pierced, your piercer who's learning how to pierce you out of this tiny booklet, they've got you. They're ready to go. And it just really speaks to what a different time this industry was back then, and how different we executed piercings, and what a different experience piercings were, right? They weren't this like super trendy, cool fashion statement when this was written. They were still very counterculture. They were still underground in a lot of areas. And I really think a lot of the content of this reflects it. I also think it's really interesting to see how much of this still reigns true. The diagrams in this of like how to execute certain piercings are actually incredibly well done. And I know piercers who use techniques almost identical, if not very similar, still today. There are breakdowns of tools and setups. Obviously, our setups modernly are a little bit different because we have access to different tools and supplies, but it's damn near pretty close to how we work in my studio and in other studios. The mention of autoclaves in 1996, huge. Wow, that's so great. They really stress like changing your gloves multiple times through each procedure. When they talk about genital piercings in this, they stress only learning those from an experienced piercer in person. They're like, please, if you want to try like messing up people's noses and lips on your own, you can do that, but genitals, don't even try. And I just think this is a really cool little piece of body piercing history. It's really exciting for me to hold this in my hands and have this like little reach back into the past and little piece of our history and reminder of just how far this industry has come in, again, less than 30 years. We are who are getting pierced today and piercing today are so lucky and so blessed to have access to the knowledge and resources and services and materials that we do. So I hope you enjoyed this little time travel adventure with me and learning all about piercing in 1996. I'm always purchasing historical stuff like this, so if y'all like this video and want to see me talk more about some of the pieces I purchase and pick up for my collection, let me know, because I will definitely go full history nerd on you. And I can't wait to hear what folks think of this time travel piercing experience. All right, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'm sure we'll sit down and chat again soon. Bye.